In the quiet hallways of Lowndes High School, a routine day turned into every parent's worst nightmare. On the morning of January 10th, 2013, the school was still half asleep. Pale winter light pressed against the windows, and the muffled hum of ventilation filled the empty corridors. Just before 6 a.m., a small group of students entered the old gym, expecting nothing more than the usual early morning practice and chatter. But instead, they froze. One of them pointed toward the far corner, where the tall, rolled-up wrestling mats were stored. Something looked wrong. A pair of sock-covered feet protruded from the top of a vertical gym mat. Feet that weren't moving. And within seconds, the silence shattered. Someone screamed. Another student ran to get help. A teacher rushed in, and for a moment, no one seemed to breathe. The air felt impossibly heavy. The mat towered above them, over 6 feet tall, and wedged inside, upside down, was the body of a student. That student was 17-year-old Kendrick Johnson. Kendrick, known as KJ to friends, was a bright, energetic athlete. A football player. A kid who laughed easily, who dreamed of going pro, who was liked by teammates and teachers alike. But in that early morning moment, none of that seemed real. All that stood before the stunned onlookers was an unthinkable scene. When emergency responders arrived, they wasted no time. But it was already clear, too clear, that Kendrick was gone. Soon, the gym was sealed off. Yellow tape stretched across the entrance. Administrators whispered. Students gathered outside in disbelief. And as the first police officers began their initial walkthrough, confusion grew with each passing minute. How had a healthy, athletic teenager ended up inside a gym mat? Why was he alone? What had happened between the previous afternoon and this terrible morning? Within hours, investigators floated a possibility so strange that it rippled through the school like a shockwave. Could it have been an accident? But as Kendrick's family soon learned, the official story was about to collide with something far darker, something that would ignite a decade-long fight for truth. Because to them, and to many who saw the photos, the gym layout, the evidence, an accident didn't make sense. Not then, not now, and certainly not with so many questions left unanswered. As the sun rose over Lowndes High School that January morning, one thing was already clear. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was a mystery that would divide a community, capture national attention, and leave Kendrick's family searching, desperately, for justice. Before the investigation, before the headlines, before the controversy that would grip an entire nation, there was simply Kendrick. 17 years old. Soft-spoken, but confident. A kid who dreamed big, worked hard, and rarely complained. Friends called him KJ, a nickname that matched his easygoing personality. Teachers remembered him as polite, focused, and humble, a student who didn't cause trouble and didn't go looking for it. He loved football, the pulse of the game, the electricity of Friday nights. His speed on the field made him stand out, but off the field, he was the kind of teen who helped carry equipment without being asked. He had hopes of one day playing professionally, not because he craved fame, but because the sport felt like home to him, something he could rely on, something that felt clear and predictable in a world that often wasn't. At home, the Johnson family was close. Kendrick's parents, Kenneth and Jackie, were proud of their children and devoted to keeping them safe and grounded. For them, Kendrick wasn't just an athlete. He was the quiet presence who brought calm into the house, the kid who joked around with siblings and stayed up late watching sports highlights. Which is why, on January 10th, 2013, when they received the phone call no parent should ever have to answer, their world collapsed in seconds. But that devastation didn't start with that morning phone call, not for Kendrick. It began the day before. The day before the discovery, setting the stage. January 9th, 2013. A Wednesday. A day that should have ended like any other. Classes, jokes in the hallway, practice, plans for the weekend. Kendrick was seen laughing with friends, carrying his books, moving through the school as part of the usual flow of teenagers navigating another long day. Security cameras captured him at various points, walking through the gym, passing through hallways, heading toward his next class. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. But there's a moment the timeline hinges on. Sometime between after-school hours and late evening, Kendrick's whereabouts inside the school become uncertain. Different accounts later point to different possibilities. Who saw him last? What route did he take? Who was still inside the building after hours? These uncertainties would later become major points of contention, tiny fractures in the official story that slowly widened into full-blown suspicion. That night, Kendrick never came home. When his mother noticed he hadn't returned, she assumed he was at a friend's house or running late. But as the hours passed, worry turned into fear. She began making calls, checking with friends, contacting school staff. Nothing. No one had seen him. By the time dawn approached, panic had settled deep into the family's chest. And just as they prepared to start searching the school themselves, word arrived. A student had been found. In the gym. Unresponsive. Back to the morning of January 10th, inside the gym. As detectives stepped into the old gym, the scene was already surreal. The mat, over 6 feet high, rolled tightly, its interior diameter just enough for an arm to fit through, stood upright in a storage area. Kendrick's body was inside, head first, his feet pointing upward. There were no signs of a struggle around the mat. No overturned benches. No visible blood on the floor. But what caught the attention of almost everyone present was something subtle, something that would later become a cornerstone of the family's argument. Kendrick had been found with one arm pinned to his side, as though he had slipped in rather than forced his way out. To some investigators, this detail fit an accidental narrative. To his family, it made no sense at all. The initial police response was cautious, methodical. But the moment they learned Kendrick had been missing since the previous afternoon, the questions multiplied. Why hadn't anyone checked the gym sooner? Why didn't the security system record his final moments? And how long had he been inside that mat before being discovered? Already, the story was fraying at the edges. But the most controversial detail was still to come. Within hours, authorities would announce a theory that stunned the Johnson family and split the community. Kendrick had climbed into the gym mat to retrieve a pair of shoes and suffocated accidentally. But as Kendrick's parents would soon make clear, they did not believe that for a single second. And once the inconsistencies began piling up, they weren't alone. As investigators surveyed the scene in the old gym, they faced a puzzle, one that demanded an explanation. And by the end of that same day, law enforcement offered one. Kendrick Johnson died in a tragic accident. According to investigators, Kendrick often stored his shoes in the gym mats. Space inside the shared lockers was limited, and athletes sometimes hid personal items where others wouldn't look. The theory went like this. Kendrick had placed a pair of shoes inside the mat. He returned to retrieve them. Since the mats were stored vertically, he climbed onto the bleachers, reached down into the narrow opening, and slipped. With his weight shifting forward, he fell headfirst into the mat. He became trapped, unable to move, unable to breathe. It was a narrative that attempted to make sense of an otherwise impossible situation. And on paper, it seemed like a tragic fluke, something investigators believed could happen to anyone, especially a tall, athletic teenager. But the moment that explanation reached Kendrick's family, it collided with disbelief. To them, there was no universe in which Kendrick voluntarily climbed into a gym mat. Not like that. Not alone. Not without trying to free himself. Jackie and Kenneth Johnson knew their son. They knew his habits, his routines, his athletic instincts. And nothing about the shoe retrieval scenario felt right. Still, the police pressed forward with the accident narrative, focusing on several key details. The gym mat layout, a closer look. To understand the official theory, investigators needed to examine the setup inside the old gym. Dozens of wrestling mats stood upright, tightly packed together. These weren't small foam rollers. They were massive, thick, heavy cylinders, difficult to tip or move without effort. Kendrick's mat was one of the tallest, standing more than 6 feet high. Inside, the opening was approximately 14 inches in diameter. Kendrick's shoulders measured 19 inches across. This discrepancy would later become one of the most heavily debated pieces of physical evidence in the entire case. But on that first day, investigators believed he may have raised his arms above his head, narrowing his profile so he could squeeze through. Gravity then did the rest. He slipped. He fell. He could not reverse the position. Investigators concluded he became trapped, his body angled vertically, blood rushing to his head until oxygen deprivation took hold. Death, they ruled, was caused by positional asphyxia, a form of suffocation brought on by the inability to breathe properly due to body orientation. But even as officials shared these details, the family's skepticism intensified. The family's immediate reaction: "This doesn't make sense." When Jackie and Kenneth Johnson saw the mat, when they saw the position Kendrick had allegedly fallen into, when they heard investigators call it an accident, their grief turned into something else. Conviction. A deep, immovable sense that what they were being told wasn't the truth. Kendrick's mother would later recall the moment she learned of the explanation. It didn't sound real. Not to a mother. Not to anyone who knew him. The Johnsons asked the same questions many people would later raise. Why were Kendrick's shoes at the bottom of the mat? Why would he climb into a mat head first rather than tip it over? How could he have fallen in without knocking other mats aside? Why wasn't there any sign of struggle? And how could a healthy teenager be stuck without leaving scratch marks or signs of attempted escape? To them, nothing about the scene felt compatible with the narrative being presented. The school's response: confusion and containment. Within hours, administrators faced two simultaneous crises. A student had died under their roof. The circumstances were already becoming controversial. School staff followed protocol, closing the gym, rerouting students, and assisting investigators, but whispers spread quickly across the campus. Throughout that morning, students exchanged rumors in hushed voices. Did you hear he was upside down? They found him in one of those mats. Someone said he suffocated. No, someone else said there was blood. The story shifted with every retelling, but the fear was constant. If this could happen to Kendrick, could it happen to anyone? Meanwhile, teachers tried to maintain calm, but even they were shaken. Lowndes High School had never experienced anything like this. And while the community braced for answers, the Johnson family braced for something else entirely: a fight. Because the more details emerged, the more the official story began to crack. And those cracks would soon split wide open with the release of the first autopsy. As the shock of Kendrick Johnson's death rippled through Valdosta, officials moved quickly to establish a cause. Within hours, the body was transported to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's medical examiner's office. For the community, the coming autopsy represented clarity, something definitive that could explain the unexplainable. But what came next did the opposite. The first autopsy, positional asphyxia. The medical examiner's report was blunt. Cause of death: accidental positional asphyxia. According to the official findings, Kendrick suffocated because his body was trapped in a position that prevented him from breathing properly. Blood had pooled in his head and upper chest due to gravity. There were no signs of external trauma consistent with an assault, officials claimed. No broken bones. No stab wounds. No gunshot. No obvious bruising that suggested a struggle. The case, they said, was closed. But instead of certainty, the report produced outrage. To those who had seen the photos, to those who saw Kendrick in the funeral home, to those who examined every inch of the gym that morning, the explanation felt incomplete, if not impossible. And the loudest objections came from the people who knew Kendrick best. His family. The family's doubts deepened. When Kendrick's parents received the autopsy results, their grief sharpened into disbelief. They felt the findings ignored too many details that didn't fit the picture of a simple accident. They remembered the condition of Kendrick's face when they saw his body. Swollen, discolored, unrecognizable. The kind of swelling, Jackie Johnson believed, you don't get from falling into a mat. To the Johnsons, something more had happened. Something violent. Something hidden. They believed the injuries shown in later photos went far beyond what positional asphyxia alone should cause. And they weren't alone in that belief. Community members who quietly supported the family began whispering their own theories. Teachers who knew Kendrick wondered how he could end up inside a mat without anyone hearing or seeing something. Students questioned the shoe story and claimed they had never seen Kendrick store belongings that way. And local activists asked the same question that would later echo nationwide. If this was just an accident, why were there so many inconsistencies? Questions investigators couldn't easily answer. Even as officials stood by their conclusion, a growing list of unexplained details fueled the controversy. 1. The size of the mat. The interior opening of the mat was about 14 inches wide. Kendrick's shoulders were wider. Investigators argued he may have raised his arms above his head, narrowing his profile. Critics argued that even so, the fit was far too tight to allow a fall without signs of struggle. 2. His position inside the mat. Kendrick was found vertical, completely upside down, with one arm at his side. Experts later noted that people caught in confined spaces usually twist or react instinctively. Yet Kendrick appeared still, too still. 3. The shoes. At the bottom of the mat was the pair of shoes he supposedly reached for. But on top of the mat, right beside the opening, was another pair of Kendrick's shoes. Why would he ignore the shoes near the top and stretch down for the ones at the bottom? 4. The blood on the wall. Investigators noted a spot of blood on a nearby wall, but claimed it was unrelated. DNA tests supposedly matched it to a female student. But critics asked, why was blood in the gym at all? And why wasn't it considered significant in a death investigation? 5. The missing time. Security footage from the hours when Kendrick disappeared contained gaps, critical gaps. Moments vanished from the record. Angles jumped. Hours appeared missing. Officials said the cameras were motion activated. The family believed something was wrong. These inconsistencies transformed the case into a national talking point. What had initially been called a tragic accident was beginning to look, at least to many observers, like something far more complex. Community reaction. A town divided. Valdosta, Georgia, was a small community, one where people knew each other, where families attended the same churches, where rivalries played out on football fields. News of Kendrick's death hit hard, especially among students. Some accepted the official ruling. Others openly doubted it. But everyone felt the tension. Parents clung to their children more tightly. Students whispered in hallways about what they'd seen on the news. And teachers felt the weight of an unanswered question. If something else happened to Kendrick, who was responsible? Still, as much as the Johnson family struggled with the official autopsy, it was the next decision they made, the decision to seek a second autopsy that would blow the case wide open. Because the second examination did not match the first. The first autopsy had called Kendrick Johnson's death an accident. But for his family, skepticism had already taken root. The position of his body, the strange layout of the gym mat, the missing footage, it all felt wrong. And so, determined to uncover the truth, Kendrick's parents made a bold and unprecedented decision. They requested a second autopsy, the arrival of a second opinion. Within weeks, a different pathologist arrived to examine Kendrick's body. This time, the examination was conducted independently, outside of Georgia's state control, with a team that had no ties to local law enforcement. The findings were startling. Where the first autopsy had concluded accidental positional asphyxia, the second raised serious questions about foul play. Bruising on Kendrick's arms, chest, and back suggested possible restraint. Marks on his wrists and forearms hinted at pressure or force applied, inconsistent with a simple fall. Swelling in the face and head could not be easily explained by the vertical position of the body inside the mat. Internal injuries raised the possibility of blunt trauma, though investigators still debated the exact cause. To the Johnson family, it was proof. Their son had not died by accident. The contradiction that shook the case. The second autopsy contradicted the first in almost every meaningful way. Where the state examiner had said the death was natural and accidental, the independent pathologist suggested something sinister may have occurred. And the timing couldn't have been more dramatic. The first autopsy had been released publicly, shaping media coverage, guiding public opinion, and setting the narrative. Now, just as the Johnsons were beginning to demand answers, the second autopsy challenged everything the authorities had claimed. It was no longer just a local controversy. It became a national debate. The media spotlight. News outlets quickly picked up the story. Headlines oscillated between tragic accident at Lowndes High School, family questions official cause of teen's death, second autopsy contradicts state findings. Interviews with the family emphasized their belief that something had been covered up. Some journalists, carefully respecting the Johnsons' grief, reported the facts with restraint. Others leaned into sensationalism, painting the case as a mystery rife with conspiracy. Within days, the story spread beyond Valdosta, reaching state and national attention. Experts weighed in. Social media exploded with questions. Could someone have pushed Kendrick into the mat? Was there negligence on the part of the school? Were investigators hiding something? The community's division deepens. Suddenly, the small town of Valdosta found itself divided. Parents feared for their own children. Students were unsure who to believe. Teachers and administrators faced scrutiny they had never experienced before. Some community members defended the official findings, citing the first autopsy as proof. Others, influenced by the second autopsy and the family's insistence, began demanding independent investigations. The division was painful, and it would only grow as the story unfolded over the coming months and years. Lingering questions from the scene. Even with 2 autopsies, certain questions remained unanswered. Why did surveillance cameras fail to capture key moments of Kendrick's disappearance? Why had so much time elapsed before the mat was discovered? Could a teenager really climb into such a tight, upright mat without external assistance? And if someone else had been involved, who was it and why? For the Johnsons, these questions weren't rhetorical, they were a call to action. They began contacting lawyers, investigators, and civil rights groups. They spoke publicly about their disbelief, urging others to examine the case in detail. And in doing so, they ensured that Kendrick's story would not be forgotten. The family's message becomes clear. By this point, the Johnson family had articulated a central principle. We don't just want answers. We want justice. It was no longer enough to accept an accidental death. The inconsistencies, the contradictions, the evidence gaps, they were demanding accountability. And as the national media continued to watch, the story began to attract federal attention, raising the stakes even further. Because now, Kendrick Johnson's death was more than a tragedy. It was a question of truth, of oversight, of whether a family's relentless pursuit could expose what some wanted to remain hidden. With 2 conflicting autopsies now framing the debate, attention turned to the physical evidence, particularly the school's security cameras and the scene itself. The Johnson family, along with independent investigators, began piecing together the hours leading up to Kendrick Johnson's death. But the more they examined, the more questions emerged. The mystery of the security footage. Lowndes High School had surveillance cameras throughout the gym and hallways. Yet when investigators reviewed the tapes from January 9th, late afternoon to evening, there were critical gaps. Clips were missing from the exact period Kendrick disappeared. Some footage showed abrupt jumps, as if minutes had been erased. Certain angles that should have captured anyone entering or exiting the gym were inexplicably blurry or obstructed. The official explanation was that the cameras were motion-activated, and periods of inactivity were normal. But independent analysts disagreed. They noted, motion-activated cameras typically still record brief frames when movement is detected. Other students were captured moving in hallways near the same time. There was no explanation for missing footage in the gym where the mat was located. These inconsistencies fueled speculation. If Kendrick's disappearance was truly an accident, why were crucial moments missing from the cameras? For the family, it was another piece of a troubling puzzle. Something didn't add up. The gym scene re-examined. Investigators returned to the gym to examine the mat itself. Measurements, photos, and diagrams were taken. Experts asked questions that would haunt the case. How could a 17-year-old male, over 6 feet tall, fit into a mat with a 14-inch diameter? Could a person slip in accidentally without knocking over nearby mats or leaving scratches on the gym floor? Why did the body show vertical compression marks, suggesting he was wedged tightly rather than simply fallen? These questions were not rhetorical. They were physical impossibilities for many experts. Even law enforcement's own later internal reports acknowledged the unusual position of Kendrick's body. Witnesses and conflicting timelines. Multiple students and staff came forward, offering recollections of the previous day. Some claimed they saw Kendrick in the gym during practice. Others said he left for home and didn't return. Teachers remembered seeing students clean the gym, but none reported Kendrick going into the storage area with the mats. The discrepancies created a murky timeline. What Kendrick was doing in the final hours remained unclear. The minutes between 5:30 p.m. and 6 a.m. the next morning became a focal point for investigators, media, and the family. Community tensions rise. The unfolding investigation divided the town. Parents feared for their children if someone in the school environment could be a threat. Students whispered about conspiracies and cover-ups. Teachers and administrators faced public scrutiny, often fielding uncomfortable questions from reporters and investigators alike. Local media amplified the tension. Headlines oscillated between reporting facts and raising suspicions, increasing pressure on the Johnson family and law enforcement alike. Emerging questions about handling of evidence. Independent investigators soon raised concerns. Why was the mat not properly preserved immediately after discovery? Why were some security tapes allegedly overwritten? Why did initial reports fail to mention bruising and potential signs of restraint? Each gap suggested either negligence or intentional obfuscation, a point of contention that would dominate legal discussions later. Families' growing determination. By this stage, the Johnsons' goal became clear. We will not accept the story as it is. We want every detail examined, every question answered, and every possibility explored. They began reaching out to federal agencies, civil rights attorneys, and independent pathologists. Public rallies, interviews, and social media campaigns began raising awareness, turning a local tragedy into a national story of mystery and injustice. The question lingering over Lowndes High School remained. What really happened to Kendrick Johnson between 5:30 p.m. and 6 a.m.? No one had the full answer, yet. And that unanswered question would continue to haunt every investigation that followed. As the Johnson family pushed for answers, independent experts began examining the physical evidence, specifically the gym mat and the position in which Kendrick Johnson's body had been found. What they discovered only deepened the mystery. The mat's dimensions versus Kendrick's body. The wrestling mat was stored upright, tightly rolled, with an interior opening of approximately 14 inches in diameter. Kendrick's shoulders, measured later, were 19 inches across. Experts questioned the official accident theory. Could someone of his size realistically climb headfirst into the narrow mat? Could they remain upright and trapped without knocking the mat over? How would a person attempt to retrieve shoes at the bottom without assistance? Many concluded that the scenario described by authorities was physically improbable. One structural engineer later remarked, "I can't see how a 6-foot, 17-year-old could fit inside that mat without outside help or extreme contortion." The arm position. Kendrick's right arm was pinned to his side, a detail inconsistent with natural movement inside a confined space. Experts noted that a person trapped in a mat of that size would instinctively move their arms to push against the walls or shift their body. The lack of such movement suggested he may have been placed in the mat rather than having fallen in, or he could have been incapacitated before being trapped. For the family, this analysis confirmed their worst fears. The accident story didn't match reality. Bruising and trauma analysis. Beyond the arm position, additional evidence complicated the accident theory. Bruises on the back, chest, and neck suggested external pressure. Swelling in the face indicated trauma inconsistent with suffocation from a fall. Pathologists reviewing photos noted that some injuries could not be self-inflicted in the scenario described by authorities. This was a turning point. Even some skeptics of foul play admitted that the physical evidence did not fully support the official ruling. Independent experts speak out. Several specialists, including forensic pathologists and structural engineers, were later consulted by media and civil rights organizations. Their conclusions varied slightly, but the consensus was clear. There are significant inconsistencies between the official story of accidental death and the physical evidence available. Some highlighted that slipping headfirst into the mat to reach shoes was nearly impossible without help, while others pointed out that the lack of struggle marks on nearby mats was unusual. Community reaction to expert findings. The publication of these analyses intensified the town's division. Supporters of the family began demanding federal investigations. Critics argued that grief was influencing the interpretation of evidence. Social media became a battleground, with hashtags, videos, and debates emerging about what really happened. Local residents who had once quietly mourned now publicly questioned the school, law enforcement, and the first autopsy report. The timeline problem remains. Physical impossibility was only one part of the puzzle. Another major concern was the timeline. Security footage gaps created uncertainty about Kendrick's movements between 5:30 p.m. and 6 a.m. No staff reported seeing him in the gym after practice. Witnesses offered conflicting statements about who was still in the building late that evening. Experts and investigators noted that these gaps made it difficult, if not impossible, to reconstruct a credible sequence of events supporting the accident theory. The family's resolve strengthens. Faced with mounting inconsistencies, the Johnsons' determination intensified. They began to document expert testimony challenging the accident narrative, physical impossibilities in the official report, gaps in evidence and witness statements. They vowed to keep the story alive, arguing that if their son's death was truly accidental, it should be provable. But if it was not, the truth must be uncovered. And as their fight for justice gained traction, more questions surfaced, questions that would eventually involve federal authorities. The haunting reality remained. Even experts could not explain how Kendrick Johnson ended up inside that mat in the way he was found. The official story, in their eyes, did not fit the evidence. As the investigation unfolded, attention began to shift toward digital evidence, specifically the cell phone records of Kendrick Johnson and those around him. In an era when nearly every teenager's life is intertwined with their phone, the data became a critical part of reconstructing his final hours. Tracking Kendrick's last movements. Investigators and independent analysts attempted to trace Kendrick's movements through his cell phone. The results were puzzling. Call logs indicated he made no calls after leaving practice, but texts were sent and received late into the evening. Location data suggested his phone remained in or near the school for longer than initially believed. Some messages were deleted before records could be fully recovered, raising suspicions of tampering. To the Johnson family, these anomalies were troubling. "We know Kendrick. He would have called us. He wouldn't just disappear. Something happened in that school," Jackie Johnson later said. Contradictions in witness statements. Cell phone analysis also highlighted inconsistencies in witness accounts. A student claimed to have seen Kendrick leave the gym around 5:30 p.m., yet his phone indicated activity after that time in the gym area. Another student said the gym was empty after hours, but phone pings suggested the presence of multiple devices in the building. These discrepancies deepen the uncertainty about who was in the gym and when. The significance of deleted data. One of the most concerning discoveries was that certain text messages and call logs were missing or wiped from Kendrick's phone. Investigators later suggested the data may have been automatically deleted due to storage limits. Family and independent analysts, however, argued that the deletion seemed selective and suspicious, particularly given the timing and the content references to the gym. This fueled growing suspicions that critical evidence had been lost or intentionally removed. New leads emerge. As cell phone data was scrutinized, potential leads arose. Multiple devices were detected near the gym during the evening hours, raising questions about who was present. Some timestamps suggested activity occurred at times when school staff were supposedly absent. Investigators attempted to identify the owners of these devices, but progress was slow and fraught with obstacles. These digital breadcrumbs became a central pillar in the family's ongoing fight for answers. The role of technology in the investigation. The Kendrick Johnson case demonstrated the challenges of relying on technology for truth. Security cameras had missing footage. Cell phones had deleted messages. Data from devices sometimes contradicted physical evidence. Each piece, while incomplete on its own, hinted at a story that the official narrative could not fully explain. Family frustration and persistence. Frustrated by gaps in the investigation, the Johnson family continued to push for a full review. They reached out to federal authorities to examine the case beyond local jurisdiction. They brought in forensic digital experts to analyze phones and data logs. They began documenting every discrepancy, building a record of evidence that contradicted the official story. Jackie Johnson often emphasized the emotional toll. Every phone record we saw told a different story. Every missing piece made us feel like the truth was being hidden from us. The community watches closely. As the investigation expanded to include digital evidence, the town of Valdosta grew more anxious. Parents worried about students' safety. Local media reported inconsistencies, often sparking heated debates online. National attention grew, with the story being picked up by major outlets citing both the autopsy contradictions and now cell phone anomalies. The combination of physical impossibility, conflicting autopsies, and suspicious phone data made it clear that Kendrick Johnson's death was no simple accident. The case was no longer just about grief. It was about uncovering truth. And as legal battles loomed on the horizon, the Johnson family prepared for the next phase, challenging the system itself to get answers. As the Kendrick Johnson case gained national attention, the focus began shifting from the tragic death of a teenager to the conduct of institutions responsible for protecting him. Questions arose not only about the circumstances of his death, but also about how the investigation was handled or mishandled. The first red flags. From the outset, the Johnson family noticed anomalies in the official response. Security footage had gaps and inconsistencies. Initial reports minimized injuries or described them vaguely. The gym mat itself was moved multiple times before a thorough forensic examination. To outsiders, these might seem like procedural oversights. To the family, each misstep raised urgent questions. How could so many mistakes happen in one of the most important investigations of our lives? Jackie Johnson asked. Community suspicions grow. Local parents and students began sharing concerns. Social media amplified these suspicions. Some claimed that school officials had cleared areas of evidence too quickly. Others questioned why no teachers or staff had reported hearing Kendrick struggling inside the gym. Rumors circulated that police reports were incomplete or inconsistent with witness statements. Though unproven, The whispers created a pervasive sense of mistrust toward those in authority. Questions about the autopsy process. The first autopsy, conducted by the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, became a flashpoint. Independent pathologists argued that certain injuries were ignored or downplayed. The vertical positioning of Kendrick's body, the bruising, and internal trauma were not fully accounted for in the initial report. Photographic evidence showed injuries inconsistent with an accidental fall, but the official narrative remained unchanged. To the Johnson family, this indicated either gross incompetence or intentional oversight. Federal involvement begins. As frustration mounted, the Johnsons contacted federal authorities. Investigators from the Department of Justice began reviewing the case to determine if civil rights violations had occurred. Federal investigators were particularly interested in the timing of the response by local law enforcement, evidence handling, and whether the scene was adequately preserved. Potential racial bias in the initial investigation. These inquiries suggested that the local investigation may not have been entirely impartial, a concern that the Johnson family had raised from the beginning. Discrepancies in police reports. Independent review of police documents revealed inconsistencies. Witness statements were sometimes summarized inaccurately. Key pieces of evidence, like the position of Kendrick's shoes, were described differently by different officers. Some officers reported seeing scratches or bruises, while others did not. Even small errors contributed to a growing perception of negligence or cover-up. Media coverage and public outcry. By now, Kendrick Johnson's death was a national story. Media outlets reported family disputes official ruling in teen's death. Second autopsy contradicts state findings. Community demands federal investigation. Public pressure forced authorities to re-examine evidence, though many questions remained unanswered. The family's emotional struggle. For the Johnsons, the alleged cover-ups were not abstract. They were deeply personal. They felt their son's life had been disrespected. They believed justice was being delayed while officials prioritized appearances over truth. Every new discovery, every discrepancy, intensified their grief but also strengthened their resolve. Kenneth Johnson later said, "It's not just about finding out how he died. It's about making sure it doesn't happen again, and that someone is held accountable if it did." The broader implications. The Kendrick Johnson case became more than a local tragedy. It raised questions about how schools handle safety. It highlighted potential systemic failures in law enforcement investigations. It showed the challenges families face when pursuing justice against powerful institutions. For many, it became a story not only of a life lost, but also of a fight against silence and suppression. The stage was now set for legal battles, federal scrutiny, and a fight for accountability that would stretch over years. With conflicting autopsies, missing evidence, and growing suspicion of institutional failures, the Johnson family realized that finding the truth would not come easily. What began as a personal tragedy evolved into a complex legal battle, one that would span years and draw national attention. Filing lawsuits and seeking answers. Soon after the second autopsy, the Johnsons pursued legal action. They filed civil lawsuits against the school and local authorities, alleging negligence and mishandling of evidence. The family sought federal oversight, requesting that investigators review the case independently of local authorities. Their legal team argued that key physical evidence had been ignored and that the official accident narrative could not be substantiated. These actions were not simply about compensation. They were about forcing transparency. Challenges in court. The legal journey was fraught with obstacles. Defense attorneys representing the school and state officials often cited official autopsy findings to defend their case. Witnesses were reluctant to testify, sometimes due to fear of repercussions or uncertainty about what they had seen. The family faced repeated delays as courts debated jurisdiction, procedural rules, and admissibility of evidence. Each hurdle underscored how difficult it is to challenge official narratives, even in the face of contradictory evidence. federal involvement intensifies. The U.S. Department of Justice eventually opened a civil rights investigation into Kendrick Johnson's death. The inquiry examined whether Kendrick's rights had been violated during the initial investigation. Investigators reviewed law enforcement procedures, school security protocols, and autopsy reports. Interviews with witnesses, staff, and students were conducted under federal supervision. Although federal investigators later announced they would not pursue criminal charges, the involvement of the DOJ lent credibility to the family's claims of mismanagement and potential bias. Public and media attention. The Johnsons' legal fight became a national story, drawing attention from television networks, investigative journalists, online advocacy groups. Public pressure amplified the stakes. Social media campaigns demanded accountability, using hashtags and video content to keep Kendrick's story in the spotlight. Legal documentation reveals more questions. Court documents and filings exposed additional inconsistencies. Some reports described injuries differently than photographs suggested. Security footage gaps were noted in sworn affidavits. School policies regarding gym storage and student access were called into question. These revelations reinforced the family's belief that systemic errors, or worse, had obscured the truth. The emotional toll of legal battles. While pursuing justice, the Johnsons endured immense personal strain. Repeated hearings and media scrutiny intensified their grief. Family members recounted sleepless nights, anxiety, and fear of public backlash. Despite the emotional toll, they remained steadfast, often stating publicly, "Kendrick deserves more than silence. He deserves truth." The fight becomes a symbol. Kendrick Johnson's case transformed from a local tragedy into a broader symbol of families demanding accountability. Parents across the country followed the story, fearing similar injustices in their communities. Advocates cited the case as an example of systemic failures in school safety and law enforcement procedures. Legal teams and civil rights organizations studied it to identify patterns that might prevent future tragedies. The unresolved questions. Even as legal proceedings unfolded, the family's central questions remained. How did Kendrick end up inside the mat? Were there witnesses who saw what really happened? Did law enforcement mishandle or suppress evidence? Would justice ever be fully achieved? For the Johnsons, these unanswered questions became a driving force, a motivation to keep fighting no matter the obstacles. The next chapters of the story would explore lingering mysteries, ongoing investigations, and the persistent search for answers that continues to this day. Even after multiple autopsies, legal filings, and federal scrutiny, Kendrick Johnson's death remained shrouded in unanswered questions. Every detail of that early January morning seemed to lead to more uncertainty rather than clarity. The critical hours, 5:30 p.m. to 6 a.m. The period between late afternoon on January 9th and the discovery of Kendrick's body at 6 a.m. on January 10th is the most enigmatic part of the case. Investigators, family members, and independent experts all struggled to reconstruct his movements. Witness accounts conflicted, with some claiming he left the gym while others suggested he was seen inside the building after hours. Security footage had gaps, leaving critical minutes unaccounted for. The timing of when Kendrick became trapped, or whether someone else was involved, remained unclear. These missing hours became the focus of every new investigation, the black box of the case. Physical evidence versus the official narrative. Experts repeatedly pointed out inconsistencies between physical evidence and the accident story. The 14-inch mat opening and Kendrick's 19-inch shoulder width made the official explanation improbable. Bruises, swelling, and vertical compression marks suggested external force or manipulation, not a simple fall. Shoes at the bottom of the mat raised questions about why Kendrick would reach down when others were easily accessible. For the Johnson family, each contradiction was a confirmation. The truth had been obscured. Alleged cover UPS and mismanagement. Federal investigators and independent analysts reviewed evidence handling. Some security footage had been overwritten or not preserved. The mat had been moved before detailed forensic examination. Initial reports were inconsistent, with key details omitted or inaccurately summarized. The cumulative effect was a growing perception of negligence or deliberate concealment. Cell phone evidence raises new questions. Kendrick's cell phone data added complexity. Deleted texts and incomplete logs suggested critical information was missing. Pings placed his phone in the gym during hours he was assumed absent. Other devices in the building indicated the possible presence of unidentified individuals. While nothing conclusively proved foul play, these anomalies fueled the sense that the official story did not tell the whole truth. Community impact. The uncertainty extended beyond the family. Students reported feeling unsafe in the school. Parents questioned school policies and law enforcement accountability. Local media coverage sparked heated debates, dividing the town between those who accepted the accident ruling and those who believed a cover-up had occurred. For many in Valdosta, Kendrick's death was a cautionary tale, a reminder of how fragile trust in institutions can be. The psychological toll on the family. For Jackie and Kenneth Johnson, the unanswered questions were as painful as the tragedy itself. Every day, without answers, deepened grief. Every new inconsistency felt like a personal betrayal by the system. Yet their resolve hardened. They publicly vowed to continue fighting for clarity and justice. Kenneth Johnson later said, "We're not just seeking answers. We're seeking the truth, whatever it may be." The case becomes symbolic. Kendrick Johnson's story came to represent something larger. The struggle of families against institutional failures. The importance of transparency in investigations. The need for communities to demand accountability when official narratives leave unanswered questions. Even years later, the unresolved aspects of the case continue to draw attention and controversy, keeping Kendrick Johnson's memory and the search for truth alive. The next chapter would focus on ongoing federal investigations, legal maneuvers, and the persistence of the family in demanding justice. As the Johnson family continued to challenge the official story, the case caught the attention of federal authorities. The U.S. Department of Justice initiated a civil rights review, examining whether Kendrick Johnson's death involved any violation of his constitutional rights and whether local officials mishandled the investigation. Federal scrutiny begins. The DOJ's involvement marked a significant escalation. Investigators reviewed all autopsy reports, both official and independent. They analyzed security footage, including the gaps in recordings from the gym. Witnesses, including students, staff, and law enforcement personnel, were interviewed under federal supervision. For the Johnsons, this was a glimmer of hope, an opportunity to ensure the investigation was objective and thorough. Focus areas of the federal review. The federal inquiry concentrated on several critical questions. Evidence handling. Were the mat and surrounding area preserved properly? Were key items, like Kendrick's shoes or fingerprints, examined thoroughly? Autopsy discrepancies. Why did the first autopsy report conflict with the second? Were injuries fully documented and analyzed? Potential bias or negligence. Was the initial investigation influenced by racial or social bias? Did local authorities fail to follow proper investigative procedures? Challenges in the federal review. Even under federal oversight, investigators faced obstacles. Time delays complicated evidence analysis, especially with security footage and digital data. Uncooperative witnesses hindered efforts to clarify the timeline. Procedural gaps in the original investigation made reconstruction of events difficult. Despite these challenges, the federal inquiry lent credibility to the family's claims that the case had been mishandled locally. Community and media attention. News of federal involvement amplified national attention. Headlines noted that the Department of Justice was reviewing potential civil rights violations. Local and national media highlighted the inconsistencies between autopsies and evidence handling. Public pressure intensified on local authorities to cooperate fully and transparently. For the Johnson family, the spotlight was a double-edged sword, reassuring in its visibility, but emotionally taxing in reliving the tragedy publicly. Family's persistence. The Johnsons continued to emphasize, "We need answers, not excuses. We want accountability for every step that went wrong." They hired additional legal counsel specializing in civil rights and investigative oversight. Each meeting, interview, and report became part of a long, methodical effort to expose discrepancies and demand transparency. Federal findings, partial clarity, lingering doubts. Although the federal review did not result in criminal charges, it provided confirmation of evidence gaps and procedural errors, recognition that conflicting autopsies and missing footage were significant obstacles to determining the full truth. Support for the family's contention that the official investigation was incomplete and flawed. Still, the most pressing questions, how Kendrick ended up in the mat, and what really happened during the missing hours, remained unresolved. Impact on the family and community. The federal investigation offered partial vindication. The family felt their concerns were taken seriously at a national level. The community remained divided, with some questioning why local authorities had failed to reach these same conclusions. The story inspired other families to demand accountability in cases where official narratives seemed incomplete or suspicious. The central theme emerges. By this stage, Kendrick Johnson's death had evolved into a symbol of persistence against institutional failure, the struggle to uncover truth in the face of uncertainty, the enduring pain caused when justice is delayed or denied. For the Johnsons, the fight was far from over. Every new discovery, every anomaly, reaffirmed their commitment. "We will continue until every question is answered and the truth is known." The next chapter will focus on the ongoing persistence of the family, the community impact, and the broader human and emotional elements of Kendrick's story. While legal battles, autopsies, and federal investigations dominated the headlines, at the heart of the Kendrick Johnson case was something more profound: the human impact of a life cut short and the ripple effects on a community grappling with grief, suspicion, and fear. Kendrick as a son, brother, and friend. Kendrick Johnson was not just a student or athlete. He was a loved family member and friend. He spent time with siblings, often joking and teasing them. Friends remembered him as kind, attentive, and loyal. Teachers recall the young man who, despite his athletic prowess, remained humble and respectful. His loss left a void in the lives of those closest to him, a grief compounded by unanswered questions and public scrutiny. Family struggles with trauma. For the Johnsons, daily life became a struggle. Every phone call, news report, and legal development reminded them of Kendrick's absence. Public attention made private mourning difficult. Yet, their grief was channeled into action, using each setback to fuel their pursuit of justice. Jackie Johnson frequently spoke about the emotional toll. "The hardest part isn't just losing him. It's knowing that someone, somewhere, might be hiding the truth." Impact on the school and students. Lowndes High School felt the shockwaves as well. Students reported anxiety about being alone in school spaces after hours. Teachers and staff were forced to answer uncomfortable questions about safety protocols and the investigation. The tragedy altered the culture of the school, emphasizing vigilance and awareness. Alumni and local youth also reflected on Kendrick's death as a cautionary tale: how one moment of tragedy can change perceptions of safety and trust. Community mobilization. Kendrick's death sparked community action. Vigils and memorials were held, drawing residents together in mourning and solidarity. Local advocacy groups organized events to highlight systemic issues in school safety and law enforcement practices. Discussions about equity, oversight, and accountability emerged, particularly around how local authorities handle investigations involving minority communities. For many, Kendrick's story became a rallying point for broader social justice efforts. Media and national attention humanized the story. National coverage focused not only on the mystery, but also on Kendrick's life. Features highlighted his dreams, achievements, and ambitions. Documentaries and news segments emphasized the emotional journey of the family, allowing audiences to connect on a human level. Interviews with classmates, coaches, and family members painted a portrait of a bright, full life tragically interrupted. This human lens helped maintain focus on the real cost of unanswered questions and potential injustice. The lasting emotional impact. Even years later, the case continues to resonate. The Johnson family's advocacy ensures Kendrick's memory remains alive. Community members carry the emotional weight of the unresolved case. For parents everywhere, the story is a stark reminder of the fragility of safety and the importance of vigilance in institutions meant to protect children. Through grief, advocacy, and relentless questioning, the Johnsons transformed tragedy into a long-term pursuit of truth, keeping Kendrick's story at the forefront of public attention, setting the stage for justice and awareness. By now, the story had evolved into more than a local tragedy. It became a symbol of the fight for justice against systemic barriers. It underscored the importance of independent investigations when local institutions fail. It highlighted how families, even in the face of immense personal loss, can be agents of accountability and change. The final chapters of the story would focus on the ongoing fight, lessons learned, and the enduring legacy of Kendrick Johnson's life. As the years passed, the Johnson family's mission evolved beyond grief. They had witnessed conflicting reports, unanswered questions, and institutional missteps, and now they were determined to turn tragedy into advocacy and awareness. The family's ongoing advocacy. Jackie and Kenneth Johnson became outspoken voices for justice and accountability. They appeared in media interviews, documentaries, and public forums, recounting the discrepancies in the official narrative. They met with lawmakers and civil rights organizations to highlight systemic failures in investigations of student deaths. They created platforms to educate the public about the importance of independent autopsies, digital evidence preservation, and federal oversight. Their activism transformed personal pain into a movement demanding reform and vigilance, engaging experts and civil rights organizations. Over the years, the family enlisted independent pathologists to review injuries and autopsy reports, digital forensics specialists to analyze cell phone data and security footage, civil rights attorneys to challenge institutional failures and pursue accountability. Through this multidisciplinary approach, the Johnsons ensured that every angle of the case was scrutinized, leaving no stone unturned in their fight for truth. Community awareness and impact. The family's efforts had ripple effects. Parents became more vigilant about school safety policies. Students were encouraged to report inconsistencies and be aware of their environment. Local organizations hosted workshops on legal rights, investigative advocacy, and procedural accountability in cases of unexplained deaths. Kendrick's story became a catalyst for broader discussions about safety, fairness, and justice. Persistence in the face of obstacles. Despite setbacks, including legal delays, procedural roadblocks, and national controversy, the Johnsons remained steadfast. They continued to press for full access to all evidence. They consistently demanded that investigations remain independent and thorough. They used media attention to keep the conversation alive, ensuring Kendrick's case could not be quietly dismissed. As Kenneth Johnson said, "We don't have the luxury of silence. We fight because silence is the same as forgetting, and we will never forget Kendrick." The larger legacy. Kendrick Johnson's story evolved from tragedy to a symbol of resilience. Families everywhere began questioning how institutions handled deaths under suspicious or unclear circumstances. His story highlighted the importance of transparency, persistence, and accountability. Communities were reminded that advocacy is not only about legal victories, but also about raising awareness and demanding systemic change. Through their unwavering dedication, the Johnson family ensured that Kendrick's life and the mystery surrounding his death would never fade from public consciousness. Preparing for the final chapter, the story now stood at the crossroads of truth-seeking and legacy. Years of investigation, autopsy disputes, and federal involvement had built a complex, controversial narrative. The Johnson family's persistence had inspired others to question, investigate, and advocate. What remained was the enduring quest for justice, clarity, and remembrance, the elements that define Kendrick Johnson's legacy. The final chapter will conclude the story by reflecting on the unresolved questions, current status, and the lasting message of Kendrick Johnson's life and family's pursuit of truth. After years of investigation, legal battles, and public scrutiny, the story of Kendrick Johnson remained unresolved yet powerful, leaving a lasting imprint on his family, community, and beyond. The current status of the case. Even today, the central questions linger. How did Kendrick Johnson end up inside the gym mat? Were there witnesses who could provide clarity but remained silent? Were errors, negligence, or intentional obfuscation responsible for the gaps in the investigation? Will full accountability ever be achieved? Federal authorities concluded no criminal charges would be filed, but civil rights reviews and public scrutiny continue, keeping the conversation alive. For the Johnson family, the journey is far from over. They continue to pursue every lead, every document, and every potential path toward truth. The family's message. The Johnsons have consistently emphasized, we fight not just for Kendrick, but for every family who might face unanswered questions when tragedy strikes. Their advocacy reflects a broader truth. Justice is rarely instant, and truth requires persistence. Through public appearances, interviews, and community engagement, they have turned their grief into a force for awareness, accountability, and reform. Community and national impact. Kendrick's story has resonated far beyond Valdosta. Parents, students, and teachers now question how schools ensure safety and accountability. Civil rights groups highlight the case as an example of the importance of independent investigations. Journalists, documentarians, and social media campaigns continue to examine the inconsistencies, keeping Kendrick's story in the public eye. The tragedy has become a cautionary tale, reminding communities that oversight, transparency, and vigilance are critical. Lessons from Kendrick Johnson's life and death. Kendrick's story teaches several enduring lessons. The value of vigilance. Small gaps in procedure can have profound consequences. Persistence in the face of injustice. The Johnson family exemplifies how relentless pursuit can illuminate truth, even when systems fail. The importance of human memory. Friends, family, and community members carry the memories and values of those lost. The power of awareness. Public attention can pressure institutions to address mistakes and prevent future tragedies. The enduring question. Even as years pass, one question remains central. What truly happened to Kendrick Johnson in the quiet hours at Lowndes High School? While answers remain elusive, the quest for truth continues, inspiring families, communities, and advocates to never accept incomplete explanations when lives are lost. Closing reflection. Kendrick Johnson's death was more than a tragic accident. It became a story of unanswered questions, family perseverance, community reflection, the pursuit of justice against the odds. Though the mystery endures, his life, legacy, and the tireless advocacy of his family ensure that Kendrick Johnson will never be forgotten. And perhaps most importantly, his story reminds us all, even in the face of uncertainty, grief, and injustice, courage, persistence, and the relentless search for truth can shine a light through the darkest of mysteries.